I thought the $20,000 I saved would be my bridge back into the family, a wedding gift to prove I belonged. But when Sophie's message opened a live stream, I saw the truth. My sister walked down the aisle in a Long Island ballroom, my parents cheering beside her, and every seat was filled except the one meant for me. My hands clutched the velvet box under my desk, knowing I was erased in real time. And just when I thought the humiliation was enough, my phone rang. It was Emily demanding the money. What I said next turned that envelope from a peace offering into evidence, and from that moment, my story stopped being about their wedding and became about my freedom. My name is Rachel Monroe. I was staring at my computer screen in the Manhattan office, where I spent most of my days the hum of voices and phones, creating the usual background noise, when a message notification from Sophie lit up the corner. I clicked without thinking, expecting a work file, or maybe a casual meme. Instead, the Facebook link opened straight into a live video, and my chest tightened before my brain even processed what I was seeing. Emily was walking down an aisle strewn with white petals, her veil shimmering under chandeliers. My sister, in a designer gown, looked every bit the bride in a picture-perfect Long Island wedding. The camera panned over rows of smiling faces. And there they were. My parents, Evelyn and Richard, laughing, clapping, proud. Everyone who mattered in my bloodline was there. Everyone except me. My stomach turned cold. My phone buzzed again and again, text after text from friends. Why aren't you there? Did you get stuck in traffic? Are you okay? I stared at the screen as if maybe the image would shift. Maybe this was some cruel filter or mistake. But the bride was Emily, my sister. My parents by her side, my family basking in joy, and I was at my desk 30 miles away, as if I had never existed. The camera lingered on my mother, smoothing Emily's veil. I heard her laugh through the speakers. It was the sound that once meant comfort, when I was a child, now slicing through me like glass. The comments under the live stream scrolled quickly, heart emojis and congratulations. Sophie's message followed, "I thought you knew." My hand trembled so badly I nearly dropped the mouse. I pulled out my phone, opened the group chat with some college friends. Pictures were already flooding in. Emily cutting the cake, my father with his wine glass, raised high, cousins posing in rented tuxedos. One message read, "Rachel must be late." Another said, "Where is she? She thought she would be maid of honor." I couldn't bring myself to reply. The walls of the office seemed to shrink. I closed the browser, but the image stayed branded in my mind. My sister's vows. My parents are smiling. My empty chair among the rows of relatives. I pressed my palms into my thighs, trying to ground myself. The air conditioner blew cold, but sweat gathered at the back of my neck. I reached for my purse under the desk, and my fingers brushed against the velvet box I had tucked away days ago. I pulled it out slowly, as if touching it might burn. Inside was a cream envelope with 20 crisp $1,000 bills. $20,000. My gift for Emily's wedding. Money I had saved from selling off a chunk of my tech investments, something I had planned carefully to show her, to show my parents that I wasn't the failure they painted me to be. I thought about the night I prepared it, writing her name in neat cursive on the envelope. I had imagined walking into the reception, handing it over with a smile, proving I could be generous, proving I wanted to be part of the family celebration despite everything. I had told myself this would be a bridge, a peace offering. Now that envelope felt like a cruel joke. My chest tightened as I stared at it, my vision blurring. I placed it back into the velvet box with deliberate care, closed the lid, and held it in my lap. For a long moment, I just sat there listening to the muffled laughter from coworkers, the clatter of keyboards, the normal sounds of a day that had just become anything but normal. The live stream was still running on my screen, frozen in the corner, because I hadn't dared to close the window completely. I glanced at it once more, saw Emily kissing her groom as confetti rained down. The crowd roared in approval, and I thought I saw my parents wipe tears from their eyes. My hand clenched the velvet box tighter. Someone from my team passed by my desk, asked if I was joining the afternoon call. I nodded automatically, though I had no idea what they had just said. My mind was nowhere in that office. It was trapped in Long Island in a ballroom where my entire family celebrated while I was deliberately kept away. I minimized the window, silenced my phone, and pressed my forehead against the cool surface of the desk. My breath came shallow, sharp. I had always known I was second best in their eyes. But watching the proof live, watching the smiles and cheers as if I didn't exist, was something I never prepared for. The envelope remained in my hands, heavier than it had any right to be. I whispered under my breath, not to anyone in particular, just to the empty air around me. They didn't want me there. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to be there either. The office chatter carried on, oblivious to the way my world had just shifted. I slipped the velvet box back into my purse, straightened in my chair, and forced myself to breathe. The live stream ended. The screen went black. And in the silence it left behind, I understood something had broken for good. I closed my eyes at my desk, the city noise muted by the pounding in my ears, and without meaning to, I was back in that house in New Jersey where favoritism was not just a habit, but the air we breathed. I saw Emily at 12 already being driven to ballet in a shiny new minivan, while I, 10 years old, stood at the window holding a library card and wondering why no one ever seemed to notice me. Growing up in Princeton had meant privilege for some, but not evenly shared. Emily got the classes, the extracurriculars, the spotlight. She was enrolled in dance, piano, art camp, every activity my parents could pay for. When I asked for lessons of my own, my father said money did not grow on trees yet. Weeks later, a new pair of pointe shoes arrived for Emily custom, ordered from a boutique in Manhattan. By high school, the difference had become impossible to ignore. Emily got a brand new silver Honda Civic for her 16th birthday, parked proudly in our driveway with a big red bow. I watched from my bedroom window as neighbors clapped and congratulated her. My own ride was the number 605 bus, and when I scraped together enough money from babysitting, I bought myself a second-hand bike. My mother said it built character. Dinner was where it hurt most. The long oak table was supposed to be where family connected, but for me, it was where my achievements were drowned out. I remembered one night so vividly, it still burned behind my eyelids. I was 17, exhausted from a day of working at the grocery store after school, but glowing with the news I had just received. I had secured an internship at a small Wall Street firm for the summer, something my guidance counselor said could change my future. I sat at the table, pasta cooling on my plate, and tried to speak over Emily's chatter about her upcoming pageant. I told my parents about the internship, how selective it was, how proud I felt. My father nodded distractedly, barely looking up from his glass of wine. My mother tilted her head and smiled before turning back to Emily. "Did you tell them about the competition at school?" she asked, her eyes bright. Emily grinned and launched into the story of how she had won a small art contest. They clapped, they asked questions, they praised her as if she had just been accepted to Harvard. My news, something that had taken months of applications and interviews, evaporated into silence. I sat there chewing cold pasta, forcing myself not to cry. My fork shook in my hand, but no one noticed. Later that night, I wrote in my journal that it was the moment I realized I was never going to be celebrated in that house. Those memories never really faded. Even when I earned my place at NYU, it felt like I had clawed it out of the cracks left between Emily's spotlight. I had filled out every scholarship form, worked weekends, stocking shelves, studied until my eyes burned. The day the acceptance letter came, I jumped in the kitchen, heart racing, ready to share. Emily happened to walk in at the same time holding a flyer for another pageant. When I told my mother about NYU, she smiled and said that was nice, then asked Emily what dress she would wear. At school, I had learned to hide my disappointment by working harder. I pushed myself because no one else would. I took every AP class, stayed late for tutoring, and dreamed of a future where my last name would not automatically put me behind Emily. I still remember the counselor at NYU orientation asking about family support, and me laughing because it was easier than explaining the truth. The most painful part was that Emily knew. She knew the way they treated me, and she used it. She teased me when I got a B on a calculus test, telling me our parents would never be impressed unless I pulled a perfect GPA. When I won a debate competition, she rolled her eyes and said, Mom and Dad only cared if she won hers. She had a way of twisting the knife, turning my little victories into reminders of my invisibility. That summer internship on Wall Street changed everything for me, though, not at home. I commuted into the city in cheap suits from clearance racks, while Emily drove her Civic to practice with her dance troupe. I came home one night with blisters on my feet and pride in my chest, hoping maybe they would ask me about my day. Instead, I found balloons in the living room. Emily had been named captain of her dance team, and they had thrown a party. No one even knew I had presented to a board of investors for the first time. It was there in the shadows of those nights that I learned to stop expecting recognition. Every milestone of mine was either ignored or compared to until it seemed insignificant. Emily's every achievement was inflated into a triumph. The pattern never broke. Sitting in my Manhattan office years later, clutching that velvet box, I realized how those childhood dinners had prepared me for this moment. The live stream had been just another performance, one more stage, where Emily shone under the lights while I watched from outside the frame. It should not have surprised me, but the sting of being erased had not dulled with time. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the city beyond the glass. Cars crawled down Madison Avenue, tiny figures on sidewalks rushing home. My phone lay silent now, drained of the frantic texts and photos. I thought of that night at 17, my pasta culled my parents' attention elsewhere, and I understood why the sight of Emily's wedding without me hurt so sharply. It was not new. It was simply the culmination of years of practice of being the shadow beside her light. I gathered my things, slowly slipping the velvet box deeper into my purse. The office had thinned out with colleagues heading to meetings or leaving for the day. I walked to the elevator, my heels echoing in the hallway. As the doors slid shut, I whispered to myself that maybe it was time to stop trying to sit at a table that had never saved me a seat. The elevator carried me down in silence, the numbers blinking overhead, and by the time I stepped into the marble lobby, I felt the fatigue of years pressing on my shoulders. Outside, the January wind cut sharp against my face. I pulled my coat tighter and walked quickly down Madison Avenue, heels clicking, eyes fixed ahead. I was not headed anywhere in particular. I only needed airspace to breathe and a place to remember why I had believed that envelope in my purse could ever matter. I had built my independence piece by piece. In 2018, when everyone thought the market was too volatile, I had spent nights reading earnings reports, tech blogs, and analyst notes. While Emily was still parading in front of our parents with pageant crowns, I was hunched over a second-hand laptop in my tiny NYU studio, charting candlesticks and tracking trades. I started small scraps of savings from internships, reinvested every dollar of profit back into the market. I remember the rush the first time one of my positions doubled. No one clapped for me then. I celebrated alone with a slice of dollar pizza. By 2020, I had built enough confidence to buy into software companies when most people were panicking. It was not glamorous. It was nights of doubt, days of refreshing market tickers until my eyes burned. But I kept going, and slowly the numbers grew. My portfolio became the one thing in my life that acknowledged my effort. Early in 2024, after weeks of watching one stock climb, I sold a block of shares and closed out with $40,000 in profit. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the confirmation on the screen, my heart racing. For a moment, I let myself imagine telling my parents. Imagined the rare smile that might spread across my father's face, imagined my mother saying she was proud. The thought was so foreign it startled me. I closed the window and kept the secret to myself. I did not spend it right away. I let the money sit while I thought about what it could mean. I could have put it toward a down payment or tucked it away for retirement. But when I heard rumors that Emily was engaged, something inside me stirred. I told myself this could be my chance to show good faith, to remind them I was part of the family. I thought if I walked into her wedding with an envelope of $20,000, my gesture might erase the years of being dismissed. They would have to see me differently, even if only for one night. So I withdrew the bills from my account, laid them out on my kitchen table under the yellow light, and counted them twice. The paper smelled faintly of ink and metal. I slid them into a cream envelope, wrote Emily's name across the front, and placed it carefully into the velvet box I had kept since college. I remember running my hand over the smooth cover, telling myself this was not just money. This was hope wrapped in paper. Now that box sat heavy in my purse, not as a bridge, but as a reminder of how naive I had been. I walked into a coffee shop on the corner and ordered a black coffee, hoping the bitter taste would steady me. I took a seat by the window, pulled out the velvet box, and stared at it while people hurried past outside. I opened it, slowly slid out the envelope, and placed it on the table. The weight of it felt different now. It was no longer a gift waiting to be given. It was proof of everything my family had refused to see. Proof that I had built something on my own, that I had wanted to share it, and that they had never intended to let me stand beside them. I thought back to the last conversation I had with Emily before the engagement. She had smirked when I mentioned my job at Harrison and White Capital, asked if I was still wasting time chasing numbers. I had laughed it off, but the sting had stayed. Even then, I had wanted to prove to her, to my parents, that I was not wasting time. I was building a life, a career, a future. I sipped the coffee and felt the bitterness cut through the fog in my head. Around me, the cafe hummed with small talk students tapping on laptops, a couple arguing softly near the door. I sat alone watching steam rise from the cup and realized the envelope on the table was not a bridge. It was evidence. Evidence of my willingness to give and their refusal to accept. A woman at the next table glanced at the envelope, then looked quickly away. I tucked it back into the box and returned it to my purse. My heart slowed, my breathing steadied. The decision formed quietly but firmly inside me. The $20,000 would never leave my hands for Emily's wedding. It would not buy a seat at their table. I gathered my coat and stepped back into the cold. The sky was fading to a dull gray, the first flakes of snow drifting down between the towers. I walked toward the subway, each step lighter than the last, the velvet box pressing against my side like a secret no one else would ever claim. I climbed the station steps at Lexington Avenue and felt the cold bite my cheeks, then headed home on autopilot while the city pulsed around me. The streets gleamed with a thin sheen of melted snow, cabs hissed past, and I kept one hand on my purse, where the velvet box rested like a heartbeat I could not quiet. By the time I reached my building on the Upper East Side and rode the elevator up, the sky had turned the flat pewter of early evening. I let myself into my apartment, set my bag on the console, and stood in the quiet until the radiator clicked on and the pipes began their familiar whisper. The week that followed stretched and snapped like a rubber band. I worked. I ran in the park before dawn. I answered emails at Harrison and White Capital as if nothing had cracked open inside me. Every time I opened my phone, there were new photos from distant relatives, new posts from people I had not spoken to since high school, all praising Emily's perfect day. I muted the notifications and turned my phone face down on my desk. I could not mute the memory of the live stream. At night, I slept badly and woke to a dull ache behind my eyes. I told myself that ache would pass. On the seventh day, my phone lit with a name I knew too well. Emily. The screen pulsed while I stood in the kitchen with a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. I watched it ring, counted 3 beats, then 4. I lifted the phone, but did not answer. I set it back down and felt my pulse in my throat. It vibrated again, the same name, and I moved to the living room and switched the phone to speaker. I opened the voice memo app on my laptop and pressed record. New York law required only one party to consent to recording, and I had learned a long time ago to protect myself when family conversations turned slippery. I took a long breath and accepted the call. Her voice came bright at first, the way she sounded when she was about to ask for something. She said she hoped I was well, and then she asked if I planned to send the gift I had prepared. She referred to it as the 20, as if it were a party favor, mislaid as if the number had not taken me years of grit to build. I said I did not attend because I had not been invited. I said the money was staying with me. Her tone shifted so quickly I could feel it in my teeth. She said the family expected me to do the right thing. She said I had embarrassed our parents by not showing up. She said guests noticed my absence and whispered. I looked at the waveform bouncing across my laptop screen and counted a slow 4, letting silence do some of the talking for me. I said again that I received no save the date, no invitation, not even a text. I said I had checked my mailbox, my email, and even the spam folder. I said I had nothing from her. She insisted she had sent something months ago. She said maybe it had been lost and that I should consider the bigger picture. She said an envelope would smooth hurt feelings. The word envelope made my hand slide to the velvet box in my bag, even though she could not see me. My fingertips pressed the seam until it hurt. I told her I had chosen to keep what I earned. I told her traditions were not an excuse to erase a person and then ask for their money. She scoffed and said everyone gave, that our cousins had contributed, that my absence had created a problem she now had to fix. She said people would not forgive selfishness. She said the whole family would never forgive me. I felt the heat rise up my neck, but my voice stayed steady. I said forgiveness usually follows honesty, and that demanding money from someone you excluded was not honest. I said the conversation was over. She snapped that I always made things difficult. She said Dad agreed and that Mom was crying. She said Thomas was considering sending a message to make sure I understood expectations. I stared at the recording timer and thought of every dinner where I had been told I was the problem. I thought of the live stream, their smiling faces, the rows of chairs, the strangers clapping, while my family pretended I did not exist. I did not shout. I did not plead. I told her that if she or anyone else contacted me again, asking for money, I would keep a record of it. I told her I would not finance a celebration I was deliberately kept from. She called me cold. She said this was not how sisters behave. I ended the call gently and watched the call duration stamp itself onto the screen. Then I sat very still and listened to the silence that came after her voice, the way a room sounds after a storm moves on. My hands shook as I stopped the voice memo and saved it with the date and time. I backed it up to a cloud folder I only use for things I cannot afford to lose. I took screenshots of my recent calls and the 2 missed calls that had come before this one, then emailed them to myself. I opened my mail app and typed a short note to self with a summary of the call, the precise phrases she had used, the unsupported claim about the missing invitation. I attached the audio file and sent it to my personal account. I closed the laptop and placed it on the coffee table. For a moment, I just listened to my apartment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a siren wailed and then faded into the general throb of the city. I stood, walked to the window, and watched a man in a navy peacoat carry flowers down the block. The ordinary rhythm of other lives calmed me. I went to the kitchen and poured fresh coffee, then came back to the sofa and sipped it slowly until the tremor in my hands eased. My phone buzzed again. A text from Sophie appeared asking if I was free later in the week. My first instinct was to ignore it. Then I typed that I needed a rain check and set the phone face down again. I was too raw to risk boiling over at anyone who did not deserve it. I watched steam lift from the mug and tried to map the path forward. The envelope in my purse felt less like a question and more like an answer. I took out the velvet box, opened it, and looked at the cream envelope. The paper had a tiny crease where my thumb kept pressing the same spot. I thought of the hours I had spent reading earnings calls, the weekends of grocery store shifts in high school, the ungainly steps from that life to this one. The money was a symbol, but it was also simply mine. I slid the envelope back into the box and closed it. My breathing slowed. The decision sat clean and solid in my chest. I went to my desk and pulled out a small file folder. I labeled a page with the date and wrote down what had happened line by line, the facts as precisely as I could recall them. I have learned the value of a paper trail. When I finished, I tucked the page into the folder with the screenshots and a printed email receipt from my phone carrier that listed recent calls. I slid the folder into the drawer and locked it. Evening pushed its way through the windows, the gray shifting toward blue. I turned on the lamp by the sofa, and the room warmed to honey. I sank into the cushions and let my shoulders drop. The ache behind my eyes finally softened. For the first time since the live stream, I felt something other than humiliation or rage. I felt relief. The line had been drawn. There was no confusion now. I opened my laptop again, not to replay the call, but to look at a reservation that had been sitting in my inbox for a month. A refundable flight to Denpasar for late winter, booked on a whim when I had felt the walls of the city closing in. I had set it aside, unsure if I would really go. I clicked the itinerary and read the dates. I pictured a place where the air smelled like salt and frangipani, where days were marked by sunrise instead of meetings. I did not click confirm. Not yet. I just let the idea sit beside me on the sofa like a friend waiting patiently. When the apartment grew dark, and the first lights in the buildings across the street winked on, I put the velvet box back in my purse and stood. I washed the mug, closed the blinds, and turned off the lamp. The quiet felt different. It felt chosen. In the bedroom, I laid out my running shoes for the morning and set an alarm. The day had taken its pound of flesh, but it had left me with my boundary intact. I crawled under the duvet and closed my eyes. For a long stretch, I watched the inside of my eyelids flicker with leftover images of chandeliers and confetti, and faces turned away. Then even those faded. The last thing I felt before sleep took me was the steady certainty that the 20 would not move, that I would not let my work be used to buy approval that had never been offered. I woke to the gray light of Manhattan slipping through my blinds, the remnants of that call with Emily still echoing in my ears. The certainty had taken root deep in my chest. The 20 would stay with me, but I needed more than certainty. I needed space, a horizon wider than glass towers and cold avenues. I opened my laptop and pulled up the flight confirmation I had held onto for weeks. My finger hovered only a second before I pressed confirm. 2 weeks later, I was stepping off a plane into the warm night air of Bali. The air smelled of salt and frangipani, thick and humid, after the dry chill of New York. I gripped the handle of my suitcase and felt sweat bead along my hairline. But instead of discomfort, it felt like release. A driver held a sign with my name and led me to a car. The road to the resort wound past rice fields, shimmering in the moonlight, scooters darting by with families balanced easily on them. My heart slowed for the first time in months. The resort sat on a cliff overlooking the Indian Ocean. In the morning, I woke to the sound of waves pounding below, a sound both relentless and soothing. My villa opened to a small terrace shaded by palm trees. I stepped outside barefoot, the stones still cool under my feet, and stared at the horizon, where the water bled into sky. I poured myself coffee from the clay pot they left on the table and breathed. Later that morning, I joined a yoga class on a platform perched over the beach. The instructor's voice was low and steady, and as I moved through each pose, I could feel the tension unraveling from my body. My arms shook, my legs wobbled, but my mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. At the end, lying in stillness, I let the memory of Emily's call rise. Her voice demanding, accusing, promising the family would never forgive me. The anger was still there, but softer now, less sharp. Back in the villa, I pulled the velvet box from my suitcase and set it on the desk. I opened it and stared at the envelope. Some of the money had already been converted into this trip into the villa, and the flights into the freedom I was tasting with each salty breath. The rest sat heavy untouched. I took out a notebook and wrote a list across a blank page. No begging for approval, no financing contempt, no guilt for choosing myself. The words looked stark on the paper. I underlined them twice and closed the book. That afternoon, I wandered into town, the narrow streets lined with shops selling carved wooden figures and bright textiles. Tourists in linen dresses haggled for souvenirs, scooters wove around us like water. I stopped at a cafe shaded by bougainvillea and ordered iced tea. As I waited, a young Australian couple at the next table struck up a conversation. They asked where I was from, what brought me here. New York, I said, just needed to get away. The woman smiled knowingly. Family drama? I laughed a short burst, surprised she had guessed. Something like that. They went back to their conversation, but the question lingered. Family drama. Such a small phrase for the years of silence and dismissal, for the live stream of a wedding I was never meant to see. Back at the resort, I opened my phone to check emails. Among the junk and work updates, one article caught my eye. A lifestyle blog had covered Emily's wedding. The headline read, "A Fairfield County Fairy Tale." The photos were glossy and staged, Emily and Thomas framed by chandeliers and champagne towers. But what made my chest tighten was a quote from Emily herself. We were surrounded by everyone who matters most. I stared at those words until they blurred. Everyone who matters most. The 20,000 in my purse burned like fire. I closed the phone and set it aside. That evening I sat on the terrace as the sun slid into the ocean. The sky turned bruised orange, then indigo. I poured a glass of wine and held the envelope on my lap. The waves roared below louder as the tide came in. I thought about what the money had been meant to do and what it had become. It was never just paper. It was my proof, my offering, my attempt to be seen. Now, it was a reminder sharp and undeniable of how blind they had chosen to be. I tore the envelope open and spread the bills across the table. They smelled faintly metallic in the humid air. I stacked them into two piles. One pile I earmarked for investing when I returned to grow further, to keep building what I had started years ago with dollar pizza as my only celebration. The other pile I set aside for something more. I thought about the girls I saw in town carrying school books down the dusty street, and the memory of my own scholarships scraped together surfaced. I decided then I would donate part of this money to a nonprofit teaching financial literacy to women and girls. Something my parents would never understand, but something I knew mattered. The sky darkened, and the first stars blinked above the ocean. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the crash of waves, feeling the sweat cool on my skin. The decision settled into me like an anchor. The money would not vanish into a wedding I was erased from. It would become a foundation for my future, and in some small way for others too. I gathered the bills and returned them to the envelope, not as a gift to buy belonging, but as a promise to myself. I placed it back into the velvet box and slid it into the drawer of the desk. Then I sat again and watched until the horizon disappeared into darkness, until the sound of the waves was the only thing left. The morning I returned to New York, the city hit me like a wall. The air was sharp with February frost, and the sidewalks glittered with dirty ice. I dragged my suitcase into my apartment, still carrying the scent of Bali on my clothes, and tried to settle back into routine. For a few days, I managed diving into work at Harrison and White Capital, catching up on client calls, forcing myself into the rhythm of subway commutes and late-night emails. One Tuesday afternoon, I sat at my desk, sorting through unread messages, when an unfamiliar subject line caught my eye. "Thank you for creating your registry with Gift Haven," it read. My stomach tightened. I had never opened a wedding registry in my life. I clicked. The email was filled with cheerful branding congratulating me on my wedding and highlighting items already added to the list. A set of crystal stemware, a designer coffee machine, a cookware set worth over $1,000. My name, Rachel Monroe, sat at the top of the page. The registry was linked to an email address similar to mine, just off by one letter. The shipping address stopped me cold. It was the townhouse in Greenwich where Emily and Thomas lived. I stared at the screen, my hands turning clammy. I scrolled further. Relatives had already made purchases. Aunt Claire had sent the stemware. Cousin Daniel had contributed toward the coffee machine. The registry had been shared under my name, giving the impression that I was the one curating gifts for Emily's new home. The bile rose in my throat. I forwarded the email to myself twice, printed it, and sat back in my chair with the page shaking in my hands. My first thought was disbelief. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe some automated error. But the spelling of my name was too precise, the address too exact. It was not random. It was deliberate. I picked up the phone and called a number I had saved months earlier for a lawyer a colleague had once recommended. David Ross, mid-40s, practiced in corporate law and consumer fraud. His receptionist put me through, and within minutes I was sitting in his office on Madison Avenue, with the printed email in my lap. David was tall, his suit neat, but not flashy, his demeanor calm. He read the email carefully, his brow tightening as he flipped through the pages I had brought. When he finished, he leaned back. "This is identity fraud, Rachel," he said evenly. "Someone used your name and personal details to set up this registry. The fact that the shipping address is tied to your sister's residence makes the intent fairly obvious. They wanted the gifts to come directly to them while leveraging your name to add legitimacy." I felt heat crawl up my neck. So it's not just careless. It's illegal. It is illegal, he confirmed. At the very least, it's misrepresentation. At worst, it's fraud with financial benefit. These registries hold financial value, and they were deliberately attributed to you. You could be on the hook if someone claims you endorsed the purchases. I pressed my palms together in my lap to keep them from trembling. How do we prove it's them? Emily could say it was a mistake, or that someone else opened it. David tapped the papers. We subpoena the registry platform. They log IP addresses, email verification, payment details for the registry fees. If those line up with her or Thomas, it's evidence. And this shipping address, that already puts them in the frame. I let out a shaky breath. The coffee machine, the stemware, the endless comments about generosity that must have trickled back to my parents. Emily had taken not just my name, but the appearance of my support, twisting it into a gift she could display proudly while cutting me out of the actual event. David leaned forward. We can start with a cease and desist demanding they shut down the registry and return any unshipped items. If they refuse, we file a claim. I suggest you keep every single piece of communication. If your sister or anyone in the family contacts you about money or gifts again, record it. I nodded, my throat tight. I already recorded the last call. His eyebrows rose slightly, then he nodded with approval. Good. You're protecting yourself. That will matter. I left his office with the printed email tucked into a folder, the weight of proof heavier than the velvet box still in my purse. On the sidewalk, the wind stung my face, but underneath the sting was something sharper. It was no longer suspicion, no longer just family cruelty. It was evidence. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop again. The registry was still live. I clicked through the pages, each item checked off with the name of a relative beside it. I imagined Emily unpacking boxes, arranging crystal on shelves, smiling while people believed I had orchestrated it. My jaw clenched. I took screenshots of every page, saved PDFs of the items, and the donors logged the time and date. Then I wrote in my notebook the simple truth. Emily had stolen not only the money I had once considered giving her, but also the dignity of appearing generous in my name. She had turned my absence into a stage for herself. By midnight, my folder was thick with files. I closed it and slid it into the drawer with the others, the paper trail growing. The city outside my window was dark except for headlights sliding across the avenue. I pressed my fingers against the folder and whispered to the quiet room that this was no longer a family matter. This was fraud, clear and undeniable. The call from my mother came 2 days later while I was finishing a client memo at the office. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed, like she had already decided what she would say before I picked up. She asked me to come down to New Jersey that weekend, said it was important, and that both she and Dad wanted to speak to me face to face. I knew better than to expect warmth in the invitation, but I went anyway. The drive to Princeton was familiar, every exit along the turnpike lined with memories I had tried to bury. The houses grew larger, the streets quieter, until I reached the cul-de-sac where I had grown up. Their colonial-style house looked exactly the same, shutters, freshly painted, driveway clear. I parked and sat for a moment with the engine off, my purse beside me, the folder of evidence inside. When I rang the bell, my father opened the door. He was older now, gray deeper at his temples, but the weight of disapproval in his eyes had not softened. He nodded once, a gesture that passed for welcome, and stepped aside so I could enter. My mother was already in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. We skipped pleasantries. My father motioned for me to sit. I chose the armchair across from them, leaving space between us. The silence stretched until my mother broke it. "We know about the registry," she said. "Emily told us you misunderstood." I almost laughed, but the sound stuck in my throat. My father leaned forward. "Rachel, you are making this more complicated than it needs to be. Your sister is married, now she has responsibilities, a household to manage. Mistakes happen. We expect you to let this go." I reached into my purse and laid the printed email on the coffee table between us. My father's eyes flicked to it, but he did not move. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said evenly. "It is fraud. I have the platform's confirmation of the address. It is their townhouse in Greenwich. You cannot tell me this was an accident." My mother shifted, her lips pressing together. "Families do not drag each other into court. Whatever happened, it can be handled privately. We raised you to know better than to air dirty laundry. You raised me to stay silent, I answered. That is not the same thing. My father's jaw tightened. He stood, walked to the sideboard, and returned with a manila folder. He set it on the table and slid it toward me. This is the family trust, he said. We updated it last year. Most of the assets, including this house, will pass to Emily. She is the one continuing our legacy here. You chose to live your own life in the city. That is your path. But it means you are independent, and we respect that by giving her the responsibility. I stared at the folder, but did not touch it. The words sank like stones in my chest. They were not offering me information. They were presenting a threat dressed as inheritance. You want me to give up my case in exchange for a slice of property I never asked for? I said slowly. We want you to be smart, my mother replied. Stop making enemies of your own blood. Money does not replace family. Do not ruin everything over some petty argument. The bitterness rose in my throat. I reached into my purse again, pulled out my own folder, and placed the printed registry documents on top of theirs. I do not need your house, I said. I do not need your trust. What I need is for my name not to be stolen for my work, not to be used to decorate someone else's life. What I need is to stand in a room and know I am not invisible. You cannot offer that. Only I can fight for it. My father's face darkened. He picked up his folder and tucked it under his arm. If you go through with this, Rachel, do not expect to be welcomed here again. You will be cut off, completely. The words rang with finality, but instead of fear, I felt clarity. I gathered my documents, calmly slid them back into my folder, and stood. You already cut me off, I said. This is just you putting it in writing. My mother's eyes glistened, but she did not reach for me. My father held the line of his jaw like stone. The house smelled faintly of polish and lavender, just as it had when I was a girl. But it felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in around their denial. I walked to the door without waiting for dismissal. The winter air slapped my cheeks as I stepped outside, but it felt cleaner than the stale weight behind me. I crossed the driveway, unlocked my car, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands were steady on the wheel. As I pulled away from the house, the lights glowing faintly behind lace curtains, I knew I would not return. The choice had been made long ago, and now it was only spoken aloud. The evidence sat beside me on the passenger seat, the papers crisp and undeniable. Ahead, the road opened wide into night. By the time I saw the skyline again, the city looked like a row of flares against the dark. I reached my apartment close to midnight and slept like a stone. In the morning, my inbox held a reminder I had ignored for weeks. A panel on financial technology and consumer protection at a conference center near Bryant Park. I stared at the subject line and felt something inside me lean forward. I registered and went after work, part curiosity and part hunger, for a room where facts mattered more than family mythology. The lobby buzzed with people wearing name badges. Booths lined the walls with banners about fraud detection and account security. I took a program and found a seat near the aisle. The panel was titled Guarding Consumers in a Season of Scams. 4 people sat on the stage: a regulator, a professor, a journalist, and a founder named Michael Tran. He looked younger than the others, no tie sleeves rolled just enough to show he had not spent the day behind a podium. He spoke about risk, like it was a system you could map, not a storm you had to endure. He called it layered: legal, technical, and narrative. Protect the account, protect the record, and protect the story. People hear about what happened. I wrote those 3 words across the top of my notebook. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, my hand rose before I could overthink it. I described a scenario in careful terms. A wedding registry opened under a person's name without consent, a shipping address tied to someone else, relatives already sending gifts. I asked what the first move should be when the theft carries a family face. The professor answered with a list of agencies. The regulator mentioned filing forms. Then Michael said that the first move is to lock the doors, and the second is to control the timeline. He broke it down cleanly. Preserve every page and log freeze credit if not already done. verify what the platform can produce, and prepare a simple factual statement in case the story gets twisted. He said that shame is a tool scammers rely on. He said that when shame is removed, all that is left is proof and consequences. After the panel, I hovered near the stage until the small crowd around him thinned. I introduced myself and said that I was the person who had asked about the registry. He asked me to walk with him toward the lobby and listened while I laid out the details. The fake email address that was one letter off mine, the shipping address in Greenwich, the list of relatives whose gifts had already been tallied. I told him I had a lawyer and a folder thicker by the day. He said that I had already done the hard part. Then he offered help that surprised me in its simplicity. He said he could connect me to a consumer journalist who covered identity abuse in domestic settings and to a nonprofit that runs legal clinics for victims. He took out his phone and asked for mine. I dictated my address, and within minutes, 2 introductions arrived in my inbox. On the sidewalk outside, the air at street level felt colder than the stage lights had made it seem. I stood under a steam plume from a street grate and read the first email. The journalist introduced herself and explained how she worked. On background meant my name would not be used. Off the record meant she could not publish what I shared unless I later agreed. She asked if I would be willing to send a chronology and copies of any documents. No rush, take care of myself first. The second email came from a program coordinator at a nonprofit called Civic Shield. They held a clinic every Thursday for victims of identity theft and offered to help with filings and platform requests. I walked to a coffee shop off Bryant Park and sat with a notebook open and my phone face down beside it. For the first time since the registry email landed, I felt a structure forming around me. Not a net to fall into, but scaffolding to stand on. I wrote down the dates in order: the day of the live stream, the call from Emily, the trip to Bali, the gift haven email, the meeting with David, the visit to my parents. I added the steps I had taken already: credit freeze, screenshots, voice memo, printed confirmations. Then I wrote the gaps: platform logs to request, a clear letter to relatives outlining the facts for when the registry is shut down, and gifts are recalled. A line that said what I would and would not accept. When I looked up, my coffee had gone cold. I closed the notebook and sent the journalist a short reply. I said I would share a chronology and documents within a day, and that I was keeping my name off the record for now. I felt my shoulders lower as I hit send. I forwarded both emails to David and asked for his view on timing. His reply came in less than an hour. He would send a preservation request to the platform that night and a cease and desist in the morning. He asked me to hold public statements until we had confirmation of the logs. He ended by saying that the facts were on my side. On Thursday, I went to Civic Shield. The office was up a narrow stairwell in a building that had seen a century of people in some kind of trouble. Inside, the walls were lined with flyers about scams and recovery steps. A woman named Lila sat with me and reviewed my file. She spoke without judgment. She said I had done a lot on my own already, and ticked through a list to make sure I missed nothing. Credit froze. Check. FTC identity theft report. She helped me file it on their computer. Police report optional but useful for paper trail. We filled it out together, sticking to facts, no speculation, the way David would want it. She showed me how to set fraud alerts with the credit bureaus and how to create a secure folder for all records with a naming convention that would keep everything in order when the pile grew. Then she did something that made my throat tighten. She handed me a laminated card with a hotline number and told me that if my family tried to spin this as drama, I could call any time and someone would remind me that I was dealing with a crime. I walked back into the afternoon light feeling taller. On the steps, I checked my phone. The journalist had replied again, saying that my chronology was clear and that she would hold it in case a public defense became necessary. She asked if I wanted to add a short statement of values. I returned to the coffee shop and wrote one in 3 lines. I stand for my name. I stand for proof over pressure. I stand for the right to refuse when consent is missing. I saved it and sent it to David and the journalist with a note that said, "This is for later if we need it." Evening came early, the buildings turning their windows into gold squares against a blue sky. I took the subway up to my apartment and spread my papers across the dining table. I created a binder with sections and slid each document into a sleeve. Email confirmations, screenshots of the registry pages with timestamps, the list of relatives and items, the cease and desist draft that David had sent for my review, the FTC report number, and the case number from the local precinct. I pressed the binder closed, and it thumped like a solid thing, not an idea. My phone vibrated with a calendar invite from David. He had set a meeting at his office for early next week. He wrote that he expected Emily and Thomas to attend with counsel, and that my presence was optional but could be useful. I stared at the invite until the screen dimmed. My stomach tightened, not with fear this time, but with a clean line of resolve. I accepted and added a reminder to bring the binder. I stood by the window and watched cabs stream north tails of light threading the avenue. The room felt steady. The 3 layers from the panel replayed in my mind. Legal technical narrative. The law was moving into place. The platform logs would speak in numbers and addresses. The story would be written as simply as possible when the time came. In that quiet, I realized how far the days had carried me. This was no longer a fight to be seen at a family table. This was about my right to my own name and the record attached to it. I put the binder in my bag and turned off the lights. The apartment exhaled around me, the way only a room that belongs to you can. I lay down and let the city's distant noise wash over the last of my hesitation. When sleep reached for me, I did not resist. The next sound I wanted to hear was the click of a conference room door closing behind me and the scrape of chairs as everyone sat down to face the facts. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and new carpet when I walked in, binder heavy in my bag. David stood at the head of the long oak table, his expression calm but alert. Across from him sat Emily and Thomas, their coats draped neatly over the backs of their chairs. My parents were there too, my mother with her tight smile, and my father with arms crossed, as if the posture itself could tilt the outcome in their favor. David gestured for me to sit beside him. I placed my bag on the floor and folded my hands in my lap. The scrape of chairs echoed as the others settled. The air felt thick with rehearsed arguments. "We received your letter," Thomas began, his tone falsely courteous. "But this is unnecessary. Rachel agreed in principle to contribute to the wedding. This is just family business." I met his eyes steadily. "I never agreed. Not in principle, not in writing, not at all." Emily leaned forward, her nails tapping the table. "You told me you had money set aside. You said you wanted to help. That was consent." My chest tightened, but David raised a hand. "Verbal claims without proof carry no weight here," he said evenly. "What we have is evidence of fraud. The registry created under Rachel's name the shipping address that matches yours, the purchases already delivered. This is not family business. This is identity theft." My mother's voice cracked the air. "Enough of this. Rachel, you are tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding. Do you want your sister dragged through courts and headlines?" I reached into my bag, slid the binder across the table, and opened it to the screenshots. Page after page showed my name at the top of the registry, the list of gifts, the Greenwich address. I pushed them gently toward Emily. "This is not misunderstanding," I said. "This is deliberate." Thomas smirked, leaning back. "She knew about it. She said on the phone she wanted to support us. She just changed her mind after." David pressed a button on a small recorder. Emily's voice filled the room, sharp and demanding. "At least you should send 20,000. My own voice followed, calm but unyielding. "You didn't invite me. That money stays with me." Emily again shouting that the family would never forgive me. Then silence followed by the faint click of me ending the call. The room was still, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Emily's hands trembled where they gripped the table. My father cleared his throat, but the authority in his voice was thinner than usual. "Recordings can be manipulated." "Not this one," David replied smoothly. "Metadata is intact. We will submit it if needed." Emily's face flushed red. She shuffled the papers as if rearranging them could make the evidence disappear. My mother looked at her sharply, panic flickering behind her eyes. I leaned forward, steady now, my palms flat on the wood. "Here is what I require. The registry is to be deleted within 48 hours. Every gift returned to the sender or refunded. A written apology acknowledging the misuse of my name, and a signed statement that neither of you will ever open accounts or make financial representations in my identity again. Thomas laughed short and harsh. Or what? You drag us into court. You'll destroy your own family for this. I held his gaze until the laughter died. The family was destroyed the day I saw them celebrating without me. The court can only confirm what's already true. David's voice cut clean through the silence. The cease and desist has already been filed. If our conditions are not met, we proceed with litigation. I suggest you consider the optics of a fraud case tied to a wedding that was so publicly covered. Emily's hands shook harder. She closed the binder and pushed it back toward me without looking up. We'll talk about it, she whispered. Do more than talk, I replied. Put it in writing. The tension pressed against my ribs, but beneath it was steel. I gathered my papers, slid them back into the binder, and stood. The scrape of my chair echoed again in the still room. I met my parents' eyes for the briefest moment. My mother's were wide with anger and fear. My father's were clouded with something heavier, pride warped into denial. I turned toward the door, the binder firm in my hands. Behind me, the murmur of hushed voices began rising into brittle arguments. I kept walking until the door clicked shut, and the quiet hallway stretched ahead. The elevator ride down felt endless, the numbers glowing one by one until the doors opened into the lobby. The city air hit my face like a cold slap, but it steadied me. I pulled my coat tighter, walked out into the stream of pedestrians, and let the binder press into my side like armor. For the first time, I felt I had drawn a line and stood behind it. 2 weeks later, the first ripple broke into the open. A small article appeared in the local Princeton Gazette under the Community Watch column. It was not front-page news, but the headline carried enough sting. Wedding Registry Fraud, Investigated in Fairfield County. The piece mentioned a registry opened without consent, gifts rerouted, and the possibility of civil action. Names were not printed, but the details were close enough that anyone connected to my family could see who was involved. The link spread faster than I expected. A cousin forwarded it into a family group chat, adding a vague comment about how embarrassing it was. Screenshots of the registry itself began to circulate, the pages stamped with my name and the Greenwich address. Relatives whispered in messages, some asking me directly if it was true. I replied only once with 3 words. I have evidence. Then I stopped answering. By the end of the month, the fallout was visible. My mother's boutique in Princeton, the pride she had maintained for years, began receiving negative reviews online. Comments about dishonesty and favoritism appeared under her business page, posted by anonymous accounts that might have been strangers, might have been neighbors. She called me one night, her voice tight with fury, accusing me of orchestrating it. I listened without speaking until she hung up. My father faced his own reckoning. He had served for years as a volunteer advisor on the local education board, a position he cherished for the respect it offered. At the next board meeting, parents raised questions about his judgment, asking if someone involved in fraud should be mentoring students about ethics. By the following week, he stepped down quietly. The news was buried in the back pages of the town bulletin, but the sting in his silence afterward was sharp. Thomas, ever the ambitious one, had been working on a real estate deal in Stamford. A contract worth millions, whispered about at family gatherings as his big break. The partners pulled out, citing concerns about reputation. The words leaked back to me through an acquaintance in the industry. They said no one wanted to tie luxury condos to a name circling in scandal. Even Sophie, who had once been my closest friend, felt the echo. She had been negotiating a collaboration with a fashion brand, something she had boasted about when she chose to attend Emily's wedding, instead of standing beside me. The brand backed away after the registry story gained traction, wary of associating with anyone linked to a fraud investigation. I heard through another mutual friend that Sophie had called it the most humiliating setback of her career. She never reached out to me. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I worked. I kept my binder updated with every article, every screenshot, every notice. My lawyer advised me not to gloat, not to engage publicly. Let the facts breathe, he said. Let the consequences arrive on their own. I followed his advice. Though some nights I lay awake in the dark, replaying every slight, every dismissal, wondering if silence was too soft a victory. Then one morning, an email from Emily appeared in my inbox. The subject line was simple: "Sorry." I opened it with careful hands. She wrote that she hoped I was well. She said she was sorry if anything she did had made me feel hurt. She wrote that family is complicated, that weddings are stressful, that sometimes decisions are misunderstood. Not once did she admit to opening the registry, to redirecting gifts, to using my name. Not once did she use the word fraud. I read it 3 times, waiting for a line that never came. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I did not reply. There was nothing to say to half-formed remorse that dodged the truth. I closed the email and moved it into a folder labeled Evidence, where it sat beside the rest of the paper trail. That evening I sat by my window overlooking Madison Avenue. The traffic moved in glittering ribbons below, horns blaring in the distance, steam rising from vents. I held a cup of tea and thought about how the scandal had grown bigger than me, how it had wrapped itself around each of them until the weight bent their shoulders. I had not spoken a word beyond what was necessary, and yet the silence itself had become a sentence. The binder lay on the table, its spine thick with months of proof. I reached out and closed it, the thud steady against the wood. The room dimmed as the sun sank, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no urge to explain myself to anyone. A year later, I stood on the rooftop of my building in Manhattan, the city stretching below like a constellation of moving lights. The spring air was cool against my skin, carrying the smell of rain from a storm that had passed earlier in the evening. In my hands, I held a frame I had brought back from Bali, the photograph of a sunset bleeding gold and violet into the horizon. I had kept it close on my desk for months, a reminder of the day I promised myself I would never again spend energy begging for belonging. Life had filled itself with different rhythms since then. At Harrison and White Capital, I had earned a promotion not by accident, but by years of work finally being recognized. I managed new accounts, sat in meetings where my voice mattered, and returned home each night, knowing the paycheck in my account was cleanly my own. The binder with Evidence still sat on the shelf, but I had not opened it in months. The registry had been erased, the cease and desist honored. Gifts had been returned or refunded, and relatives who once whispered in group chats no longer spoke my name with pity. They spoke it with caution. My parents had not called since that winter night in New Jersey. My mother's boutique remained open but quieter, her once steady clients scattered. My father kept his distance, his resignation from the board fading into silence. Emily and Thomas stayed in Greenwich, their lives continuing under the shadow of choices they refused to name. Every so often, I saw a photo online, their smiles practiced, their captions short. I scrolled past without stopping. The absence between us had become permanent, and I no longer tried to fill it. Instead, I invested my time elsewhere. From the same $20,000 I had once sealed into an envelope, part had grown in my portfolio, another part I donated to a nonprofit teaching women financial literacy. Each report they sent me felt like a ripple moving outward, proof that the money I had once thought of as a plea for love had turned into something sharper, something that built instead of begged. Standing on the roof that evening, I thought of the countless nights I had stared at ceilings, wondering how to make them see me. I thought of the pasta dinners, where my news went unheard, the live stream that showed my family celebrating without me, the phone call where Emily demanded what she believed was owed. All of it had felt like shackles, but in the end, it had been the key. Without their refusal, I might never have chosen myself so completely. The sun dipped lower behind the Hudson, painting the water in streaks of fire. I lifted the frame and held it at eye level, aligning the memory of Bali with the present view of Manhattan. Both horizons were mine now, not borrowed, not conditional. They thought leaving me out of a wedding was their victory. They thought silence would break me, that shame would keep me quiet. But that day, watching them through a screen, I had been given another kind of invitation. Not to their celebration, but to my own freedom. I lowered the frame and let the breeze cool the heat in my chest. The city buzzed beneath me, alive and indifferent. For the first time in years, I felt both small and infinite, anchored and free. They had written me out of their story, but I had written myself into another one, where my name was not borrowed, one where my value was not conditional, one where my voice carried. That was the wedding I had accepted, the union that mattered. The day I married my own life, my own choices, my own truth. I placed the frame gently on the ledge and whispered to the night that I no longer carried their absence like a wound. It was only a space I had chosen not to fill. If one day you found yourself erased from the moment that was supposed to include you, what would you do? Would you fight to reclaim their invitation? Or would you write a new one for yourself and send it out into the world as the beginning of your own celebration?